Sean Haney here with RealAgriculture.com and Real Ag Radio, Rural Radio 147, Sirius XM. I'm pleased to be here today with Dr. Terry Griffin. He's a cropping systems economist at Kansas State University. Terry, it's great to see you.
Thank you, Sean. It is great to be here.
Okay, you recently wrote a report for USDA on tech adoption. It was entitled "Precision Ag in a Digital Era." Technology is, full throttle here right now. There's a whole bunch of different forms of technology. When you write and do research about technology, how we define that? Because it's such an over-encompassing topic.
It is. So, technology today is obviously different than, the really cool technologies from the 1940s, fertilizer. So the word technology does have a different meaning throughout time. But since about the early 1990s, precision agriculture, we can even say digital agriculture, has focused on sensors and location through GPS and other global navigation satellite systems, GNSS. And so that's where we've been focusing. The USDA report focused only on what we would call precision. And we did a compare and contrast recently with a Canadian researcher, Thomas Nielsen. And the Canadian report actually included newer forms of fertilizers being one of the technologies evaluated in the Canadian study. But the American study from USDA was the traditional precision ag technologies. And many of these aren't new. They were commercialized in the 1990s, maybe early 2000s. Yield monitors, grid soil sampling, variable rate applications of fertilizer, seeds, crop protection chemicals. And I guess the newest ones on the list are automated section control that would have been commercialized about 2006 is the date I'm using. Yeah. Automated guidance, the first year we asked that question was in 2001. I say we, it was the USDA report for those who were behind the effort then. And so the technologies we're discussing aren't new. I guess the new flavor arising from these technologies is how we use data, big data, and the evaluation of data beyond the farm gates. Once sensors collect the data and it gets pushed out, and if an aggregator gets access to those data from many different farms, how is that being used in the industry? So that's the newest part of what we're talking about.
Yeah, in terms of adoption, what's enabling it? Is it the push to become more efficient? Is it labor? What's kind of the main driving force now?
Yeah, so we've asked that question, and it's somewhat difficult to answer because back in the 1990s, if a farmer had a yield monitor on their combine, that meant that they went and deliberately bought a yield monitor, brought it home, installed it, and started collecting data. Today it means that you bought a combine. So even if you buy a used combine, there's a really good chance that there is a yield monitor there, whether you want it or not. So the idea of adoption and utilization are two very different ideas. We can measure adoption. It's much more difficult for us to report on how those technologies get used. So, for instance, automated guidance is one that we closely watch. And one of the reasons is it's the most widely used technology on our list. We're about 2/3 of all planted acres in the United States using some machinery that has automated guidance. And again, this technology does come with a lot of new equipment, but since there are usually subscription fees or other ways of turning it on, we can sort of measure the take rate on that type of technology. And some of the ones, and it's one of the newer ones, it's been around for not quite 25 years yet. The technologies that were commercialized in the early 1990s when GPS became available for civilian use, those adoption rates are much lower. We're still looking at less than a fourth of planted acres that are devoted to grid soil sampling and variable rate applications. But those are technologies that require a lot more effort, a lot more training. It requires more human capital. It requires the farmer and the farm operator to take their mental decisions away from other aspects of the farm operation and to apply it to the technology. Whereas automated section control, automated guidance, the automated technologies kind of remove that necessity for human capital and plug and play, and so the farmer could focus on other things. For instance, driving, you got 20 minutes between inrows. Automated guidance gives the farmer about 20 minutes hands-free to do something other than steering the equipment, whereas yield monitors and variable rate technology requires more of their focus, more of their attention.
And like if I and this isn't just a farming thing, this is just I think humans' interaction with technology in general. You think about all of the features that are in like Microsoft Excel
Yep.
or all of the features that are in that new smart TV. You
Yep.
you don't use all of it. In
No.
fact, a lot of times a buddy comes over, is like, "Oh, you just do this, this, and this." And you're like, "It does that? Oh my goodness!" Right? There's a sliding scale here in terms of how people are using some of those given tools.
Right, you're exactly right. It's not just the farming community. So one of my team members is a gerontologist, Lavonda Trawick. She studies aging, okay? And, I'm not sure if you're old enough to remember this, but many of our listeners, including myself, remember, as a child, our job was to be standing next to the television, turning channels until the right channel was found for whatever program was on. And that skill set was replaced by a remote control, right? And so that remote control made life better for the person watching TV, as well as the children whose job was to change channels or to twist the antenna.
Yeah.
Those types of technologies make life better, and they're widely adopted. And in agriculture, those are the poster child for things that get adopted: automated guidance, automated section control. I relate this to herbicide tolerant soybean. It may not have been better initially, but it was convenience. It made farming easier for that particular crop so that focus could be applied to improving yields for the other commodities.
When you've compared and contrast some of your findings to what Thomas Nielsen found out of Olds College for Western Canada, are there any big discrepancies, or is overall attitude, sentiment, and adoption of technology relatively the same?
Uh, for the most part, everything is on the same trends. There are some minor differences here and there, but you could apply the same thing to um, in the United States. So, for instance, in the United States, we focus on one crop each year. So, the year we focus on corn, it's just the corn-producing states. The year we focus on soybean, it's similar states, but maybe slightly different. The year that we focus on cotton and wheat, again, those are different states. Cotton would be the southeastern states in California. The year we focus on rice, it's mainly Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, California. So it's a different region each year because of the commodity. Canada is a very different survey. It was across the entire country, across all provinces, across all commodities. So it's not directly apples to apples comparison to begin with, but the overall result at the end of the day was, farmers, not all farmers, use technology. And that was one of the things I really want to talk about, especially when it comes to social media. One of the things that we both noticed is when we got on LinkedIn, Twitter, other social media platforms, and said, "Hey, here's our report, publicly available. Read it at your leisure. Here are some tidbits we would like to start the discussion." And it was amazing to watch. In statistics, we call it confirmation bias. It's based upon a worldview. So a lot of the responses from farmers were like, "No, that's not right. Everybody in my community has been using the technologies for, a decade."
I
And
saw
then
some of these reactions.
I'm
Yeah.
sure you did.
Yeah.
And I think that'd be good for us to just focus on that on our social media for a while. I mean, and it had the opposite too. Like some people are like, no, nobody I know is using any of that. And so the truth is somewhere in the middle, right? And I think our reports are probably, I'm not going to say that they're exactly right all the time, but I think they're closer than what the worldview of each individual would bring to the table.
Yeah, and just because I have this really fancy monitor in my planter and it has all the sensors and it's collecting all this data, it's doing all this really cool stuff, and we can attach other keywords like the cloud and everything. It doesn't mean I'm actually using it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of sometimes I think one of the gaps. It may be in the tractor, but am I actually using it?
Well, let me throw a little bit more complication to that. My car collects information, tire pressure, it collects engine diagnostics, and sends it back to the manufacturer. I'm not using it. Someone's using it.
Yeah.
I'm not using it. And so tractors kind of do the same thing too. There's a lot of information being collected, a lot of data being collected, I should say, and that has been transmitted back to the manufacturer. So um, as far as the farm operator, back, we've been saying this for 20, 30 years. A lot of farmers treat the yield monitor as in-cab entertainment for the equipment operator. You're just kind of looking at it casually once in a while and maybe bump the hydrostat to see the numbers go up, and which I firmly recommend people not to do that because those spikes in the data get recorded, and I can remove those when we analyze yield monitor data, but we actually lose data points, and that does come at a cost if you're wanting to use yield monitor data for on-farm experiments or drainage decisions for next year and so forth.
Yeah. Terry, do you have any sense of what the farmer wants next out of technology? Like I think of like the challenges we have with weed resistance.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so that to me, if you were to ask me the question, like, what do you want to see develop? Like, if you could have, a big Christmas present tomorrow, dealing with weed resistance through technology would be one that would come to mind. When you talk to farmers about this, what do they say?
Well, let me answer that question in a slightly different way. Back, let's say year 2003, we were, in meetings, and the automated guidance companies were there and saying, hey, look, this automated guidance is great. You don't have to drive the tractor. A lot of the farmers in that room 20 years ago were somewhat insulted by this notion of a algorithm from a satellite signal driving their equipment through the field. And farmers were saying, no, I can drive my own tractor. I mean, I can't believe you even suggested that. But fast forward to today, that's one of the technologies that those same people would say, you're not taking this away from me under no circumstances.
Yeah.
And it's something that they didn't know that they wanted and needed. Steve Jobs did the same thing with the iPhone. He said, well, I'm not listening to my customers about what they say they want. I'm going to show them what they need.
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
I got one
but,
for you.
yeah,
In my car, air
yeah,
conditioned seats. When
mm-hmm,
I first
yep,
heard about air conditioned, I live in Canada. I get heated seats.
mm-hmm.
Air conditioned seats sound really dumb.
No, it does not.
Until you're in a rental car in Arizona in the middle of summer, and you're like air condition. Oh, that's nice, right there. We all have those experiences.
No, I completely agree. My oldest son and I would give up, the navigation system. We would give up AM radio, things we don't use. Uh, Air conditioned seats, aired seats for us, and with leather, and especially when we were in the South.
Yeah.
We just came from Arkansas. Those were not a luxury; that was a necessity. Uh,
Okay, so how does we're hearing so much about AI?
mm-hmm,
Okay.
mm-hmm.
Artificial intelligence, not
Yep,
artificial insemination. We know what that
yep,
is in agriculture. So if we look at artificial intelligence and we overlay it on top of some of the current technologies we have,
yep.
where are we going from here?
So, automation is something I've been working on a lot. I'm not sure how many listeners we have that produce cotton, but cotton has funded some of my research for harvesting. So you think of cotton as sort of a tree, it's like an apples, you get fruit that becomes ripe over time, and it's not the whole plant at the same time. And we could send in small autonomous robots to harvest fruit cotton lint that is ready to be harvested that day. And I spent a lot of time doing this. From an economic standpoint, the harvesters are very expensive and they do only one thing. And if we can replace those with a whole bunch of small machines at a lower per acre cost, then they may become adopted. But I'm going to challenge your listeners on something. I've watched farmers. As an economist, I don't just worry about dollars and cents. I worry about how people make decisions under their circumstances. Everybody's different. Some people have more risk aversion than others. Some people take more chances. Some people have endowed wealth so that they can take chances and have very little to worry about. Well, hay, hay farmers. Okay, if you're going to bale hay, why do we have a bunch of small bales being produced? And not everybody. I mean, there is a row for a small hay bale, but it seems like a lot of farmers I've talked to just enjoy baling hay. And so it's not a dollars and cents economic decision, but it's what economists call utility maximization, utility, which means satisfaction, utility maximization scenario. And that's fine. That's great, but it's really hard to model when we look at just dollars and cents. And so, reason I bring that up is there will be a pushback for autonomous, just like we had a pushback on automated guidance 20 years ago when farmers were somewhat insulted by the notion. Small autonomous robots may be somewhat similar. You talk to a lot of farm operators; they enjoy operating equipment. And some of the largest acreage farmers, they're in Western Canada. There's some really large acre farmers. Western Kansas, there's some large acre farmers. And large enough acreage that the farm operator may not ever sit in a tractor. They have people who do that, and they may have an iPad and know where their tractors are, watching it through telematics. But some farm operators today tell me that they do not want to get so big with respect to acreage that they are not the person on the combine during harvest. They are not on a tractor during planting season. And
Mm.
so that's a personal decision. And I think that's one of the things that may push back on autonomous adoption.
You know, in some ways, there's some parallels here, but the line of the experience is actually a little bit ahead of the cropping systems, and that's dairy robots. And when you
Yeah.
talk to a dairy farmer who has implemented a robot, and there is the same sort of like I need to be milking my cows. I don't need a robot to do. I need to know what's going on. But what you realize when you talk to people that have implemented them is the fact that I'm still in the barn. My role in the barn has changed, and I now have all of this new information that's actually quantitative that I'm getting from the robot that is milking the cows that allows me to make better production systems that was way better than my qualitative perceptions that I was previously getting when I didn't have the robot. That to
Mhm.
me is something that we need to be paying attention to when we talk about cropping system technology.
And another word used in that situation is trust. Initially we have very little trust in a new autonomous system, whether it's automated guidance or really anything where we relinquish control. But once we learn that, a lot of times it's a black box. Once we learn that this black box is trustworthy, then we start to relinquish our control to it. But it's hard for us to give up control. It's once that trust is gained, is the to me is the barrier. That's the pivot point.
When you talk to innovators, is there enough money flowing into this sector? Is there too much money flowing into this sector? Like, what are you hearing from the developers?
So yeah, both. We've seen trillions of dollars flowing into ag tech and big data in the last decade. I guess the big one was when at the time Monsanto bought Climate Corporation for $1 billion or so. I spent a little bit of time with some different developers, and some of them are struggling to get the financing. So there's that. But we are seeing some really big numbers floating around too. I will say that for a lot of developers in the ag tech space where I spend my time, I spend my time more on the analytics and data than I do on the hardware. Hardware is hard to replicate. Um, Digital is a lot easier to imitate. So for instance, if we build a really cool economic statistical model that provides a lot of value from farm data to within the farm gates back to the farmer or to the cooperative, to ag retailer or other data sharing groups, those types of digital services are so easy to imitate. So, especially if the recommendation coming from this legitimate tool is a number, let's say yield forecast, okay? We can make yield forecasts for corn, soybean, wheat, and a lot of people really watch these things. The commodity traders, the whole world was watching the Kansas Wheat Tour last week, 2 weeks ago.
Right.
Well, if I want to make an imitation of that, it's not hard to get Excel to create a random number and maybe even just add somewhat of an error from last year's number, and it looks reasonable, right? And I could create this at virtually no cost. And for the legitimate companies, legitimate products, they're sort of disincentivized to bring their tools to market because they can be offset by a imitator so easily.
Mm, interesting. What I was wondering too about this discussion about success and funding is so many times ag tech is judged by rounds of VenCap or the amount of money that's flowing into a given product or
Mhm.
company, but sometimes forgotten in this discussion is the return that's being created at the farm gate, and
Yep.
that customer retention and the customer acquisition that sort of slips through the cracks. I feel a lot of times in this ag tech discussion.
It does. And if we look really closely, most of the tools that do get commercialized in the digital space are not intended to benefit within the farm gate so much as they are intended to benefit the aggregators beyond the farm gates.
Mm.
And within the farm gates, you look at what farmers actually adopt. Things that make life better, automated guidance, automated section control, are adopted a lot more readily than yield monitors or other sensors. And yield monitors are great, but it takes a lot of training to make use of that. And it's somewhat limited to the fields that those data were collected. But for instance, let's say you choose a farmer in your area and you send me all the data for all their acres. There's very little I can do to benefit myself as an analyst from one farm's data somewhere in the world. But if you were able to get all the farmers in Alberta, Manitoba, so to me, yeah, there's some really cool things I could do. I could get the attention of commodity traders. I can get the attention of a lot of different groups, and that's where a lot of the motion activity is happening in digital ag right now.
Do you see any differences in the adoption and just the overall focus, maybe when it comes to tech relative to farm size? Like, I think when you talk about autonomy and some of the robotics, people think, oh, that's going to benefit the big farmer. But
Mhm.
I don't know. There seems to be a lot of tools now being developed for the medium and smaller farmers too. What have you seen in
Yeah,
your research?
no, I completely agree. I've thought about this a little bit too. So, one of the things, if you got 20, 30,000 acres, you get a lot of data points, and you even got some different weather regimes, across that many acres. You got some different varieties, different products. You can get a lot of good insights just from your own acres. Now, if you're a really small farmer, so small that you don't have your own harvesting equipment, you're initially at a disadvantage. But what you probably are doing is having a custom operation, custom harvest operation come in to harvest. Well, those groups typically have all the sensors, and so that data gets fed back to smaller farms. The medium-sized farmers that may have their own equipment but not all the technology would not receive that feedback loop of yield monitor data because they may not have all the bells and whistles. So, like in our study, we were looking at, let's say, automated guidance. I have the chart here. Um, for automated guidance, the smallest farms on corn, in our sample, well, let's say 500 acres. I'm rounding up to the nearest 100. So
Yep.
a 500-acre farm is considered small, and on the larger end, 1,700 acres was larger. And at 1,700-acre farm, 80% of farmers had automated guidance, but at 500 acres, it was a lot lower adoption rate. And the same is true for yield monitors and um, other data technology. So there is a huge difference in adoption and take rates from small acres farmers to large acre farmers. Automation, we don't have that in our USDA study yet. Automation is going to change a lot of things. Think about cotton again. So the smallest cotton farms in the USDA study were about 2,000 acres, and I don't think that's a coincidence. So that's a much bigger acreage farm than the bigger corn farms in the study. And the reason is a cotton harvester is a dedicated machine that does one thing: it harvests cotton. And to cash flow this thing, you need to fully utilize it. And it's about 2,000 acres that it can harvest in the southern states, given machinery dynamics and weather regimes. And so cotton farms tend to be on increments of 2,000 acres, 4,000 acres, 6,000 acres. Well, corn, if you can harvest grain sorghum, wheat, soybean, a lot of different crops with the same machine you'd harvest corn with. So you don't have to have that same lumpy acreage for that. Well, if we go to an automated, autonomous, robotic, small machines, swarm bots for cotton, all of a sudden that 2,000 acres gets loosened up a whole bunch. We can have a 40-acre cotton farm, and this 40 acres doesn't have to be a square. It can be along, 7 sides of the field could be a creek, and it doesn't have to be rectangles anymore. So that's going to open up acreage for production and acreage for relatively small farms.
Yeah. Kind of a game changer for sure. Kerry, really appreciate the discussion here today. This is great. It's obviously a topic that's very, very critical in the now and into the future. It's not going away, and continue to have discussions with you about it. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Sean. It was a pleasure being here today.